Now, so if you'd like to make your way, you can. That's not a requirement, but a strong encouragement. So when I was a little boy, my father often made the comment that children should be seen and not heard. Right? Children should be seen and not heard, which is this idea, right, that kids shouldn't interrupt, right? This idea that children have an energy and an excitement about life that sometimes overcomes them, and their desire to participate occurs. And that means that they will sometimes inject themselves into an adult conversation. I think that's the kind way of saying what my father was saying, and that was, please go outside and play. Which was the kinder version of what he actually used to say, but we're not going to say that because there are children in the room. But this idea of who gets to talk and who doesn't get to talk is an important conversation for today's society. It's an important conversation for today's society because what we've done is we've raised the volume so high on our public discourse in order that we can outshout someone else. And when I say we turn up the volume, it's because what happens is I say something and someone else says something, and in order for us to be heard, we have to find ourselves yelling over the next person. That, of course, accomplishes nothing. Because in the process of yelling, we lose our ability to listen. And in our loss of an ability to listen to each other, we've lost civil discourse. And we've lost our ability to progress ideas. This idea of who gets a voice and who doesn't get a voice is incredibly important in today's society. Because sometimes when people feel as though they cannot be heard, the result is a sense of disempowerment, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of extraordinary deprivation, and that leads to crazy activity. It leads to behavior that we find to be so incredibly unacceptable. And that stems from a fact that people feel as though they're not being heard. And we have it in every arena of our society, in every quadrant we live, in every place we work. There are people who feel disenfranchised. They feel silenced because they can't find their voice. For those of us who are in the business of speaking all the time, even finding our voice is difficult. The recognition every Shabbat that when I get up here and I say something, that invariably I'm going to offend somebody, invariably I'm going to turn someone off, is the risk of what it means to speak every week. I was good friends with a movie critic who used to say that we're in the business of doing the exact same thing, and that is simply telling people what we think. The truth is, he said to me, you don't have to be right. You just have to be consistent. You have to know that what your message has to be is one of consistency, because what that means is then other people can respond. And they can say, I agree or I disagree. And that's why in this congregation we implemented 4 years ago this Finish Strong class. It was really more of an opportunity to give people an opportunity to offer a rebuttal for what I say here. Because in general, not always, but in general, I get to talk now. And everybody else sits quietly. And I say in general. The truth is, I don't necessarily have to be right. I have to be consistent and put out a message that you can respond to. Because our tradition requires you to respond. and not to simply accept at face value. And so I offer you this morning's Torah reading as a perfect example of beings that have power and beings that are powerless. And it all stems from their ability to speak. This week's Parsha is filled with examples of people who have the ability to speak and choose not to, and people who choose to speak and overpower others. The first example that we have in this week's Parsha is when God goes to create the world, God says, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Arakia. God says, let there be heavens and earth. God speaks and the world comes into being. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. God speaks and the world comes into being. With God's capacity for speech, God creates entire worlds. And that's, of course, reiterated in our liturgy, in the prayer that I just quoted, Baruch she'amar. God speaks and the world comes into being. And then we have this bizarre moment in the Torah in which God says, Vayomer Elohim Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu. Let us make man in our image. But who's God speaking to? And so the rabbis tell us it's the angels. And in an incredible moment in the Gemara, God goes to the angels and says, what do you think of this idea? And they say, it's a terrible idea. What do we need human beings for? The world's perfectly fine without them. You made heavens and earth. You made birds and trees. You made cattle and fish. Who needs human beings? They'll just muck it up anyways. To which God says, according to the Gemara, off with your heads. I'll make whatever I want to make. And God makes human beings. And then in the very next sentence, it says, Adam nivrat Adam, Zachar u'nikeva baraotam. God made human being, both male and female. If there has ever been in our society a voiceless group, it is those people who are born with ambiguous gender. It's only now in the 20th century that we're beginning to realize that the gender binary just doesn't work. It doesn't apply. Thank you for correcting me. Only in the 21st century are we now beginning to realize what the Torah tells us at the very beginning. It's not so simple. Not everybody's born exactly the same as everybody else. Bara utam. God said, let me create a them, a they. The people who don't go by the gender pronouns of he and her, she and him. Let's understand bara utam. There could be a they that's out there. An ever silent group of people who, because of their silence, find themselves sometimes in the untenable circumstance, and their suicide rates abound. Because when you don't have a voice, that anger can be turned inward, and one can do violence to themselves. And then the text continues on, and you know the story. God creates man in the second chapter. Of man, God creates woman. And initially, we have a human being who goes around naming everything. He has the power to name each animal. And then woman appears, and he loses his ability to start naming things. Adam, confronted by woman, becomes silenced. And then the woman becomes silenced by a snake. And the ever demise of the human project, the expulsion from Eden, occurs because each and every being that is created loses its voice. And because it loses its voice, destruction occurs. We see this most appropriately with the snake. Snake, once able to talk, is punished by losing its ability to speak. And the message is a simple one, and that is, if you use your voice to create worlds, then you are godlike. If you use your voice to oppress other people, to trick and connive, then you're like a snake. The message is simple. If you have a voice, use it appropriately. If you don't have a voice, demand that your voice be heard. Because without that, there is an imbalance in the world and destruction occurs. And Eden can no longer exist in our lives. So I ask you this morning one simple question. Who do you know in your life who doesn't have a voice? Who is the person in your life who requires your advocacy in order to help them find their voice? Who in our society lacks the ability to speak for themselves and therefore needs counsel and advocacy on their behalf? And then I ask you to do one more thing and ask yourself the very difficult question, and that is, who in your life, through your actions, through your conversation, have you silenced? Who have you taken their voice away from? Look, there's no question that at some point every parent says the exact same thing to their child. When their child continually hounds them with question after question, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? We silence their voice by saying, because I said so. But listen to that phrase, because I said so. Chaim Gano, one of the great philosophers and child psychologists, says, we spend so much of our time and energy teaching our kids something they already know, and that is we're in charge. We don't say to our children, you'll do this because I'll make you. We say, you do this because I said so. All our lives, we long for our children to speak. We sit and we wait for their first word. And then from that moment on, we ask them to be quiet. The message is a simple one, and that is we need to find balance in our world. If our speech is filled with hate, we end up with Pittsburgh. If our speech is filled with love, then our world is created and filled with family. And everyone becomes a member of our closest inner circle. Through our speech, we either invite people in or we drive them away. So, the message is simple. I ask you, who in your life will you listen for their voice? And who in our society will we say you've gone too far? Who will we say your speech is unacceptable? And to who will we say, I'm listening. I want to hear what you have to say. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184. Please rise.